My husband smiled as the security dog lunged toward our luggage. It was a subtle upward twitch of his lips, the kind of expression you only catch if you have spent 5 years studying a man face. He thought I was about to spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. He thought he had planned the perfect crime framing me for international drug smuggling while he walked away with his young secretary and millions of dollars in stolen corporate funds. What he did not know was that I had already audited his perfect plan, and I had quietly rewritten the ending. My name is Claire, and I am 33 years old. Today, I stood in the VIP security line at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, holding a warm vanilla latte, waiting for the trap to snap shut. If you have ever had to outsmart a narcissist who thought you were just a naive wife, drop your city in the comments below, hit the like button, and subscribe. You will not want to miss this execution. Section 1, 1,000 words. The morning air inside the international terminal was thick with the smell of roasted coffee and nervous anticipation. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, clinical hum that seemed to match the rapid beating of my heart. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my cup, letting the warmth ground me in reality. We were supposed to be heading to the Maldives. It was billed as a luxury vacation to save our failing marriage. David, my 35-year-old husband and the vice president of finance at a major pharmaceutical conglomerate, had booked first-class tickets. He had told me we needed time away to reconnect to remember why we fell in love. But David did not want to reconnect. David wanted me to disappear. Standing right behind us in the security line was Sienna. She was 28 years old, wore a cloud of expensive perfume, and held the official title of David's executive secretary. Unofficially, she was the woman he was sleeping with. David had insisted she take the same flight out of Chicago, claiming she had to handle an urgent layover meeting in London for the corporate board before heading back. It was a completely absurd excuse, an arrangement so flimsy and insulting that any self-respecting wife would have thrown a fit. But I had stopped acting like a normal wife 3 months ago. I was acting like a forensic accountant. I analyzed numbers, I traced hidden assets, and I observed behavior without letting emotions cloud my judgment. David was sweating. Despite the air-conditioned chill of the airport terminal, a fine sheen of moisture coated his forehead. He kept checking his platinum watch, shifting his weight from one custom leather shoe to the other. His eyes darted nervously between my sleek black suitcase on the conveyor belt and the stern faces of the Transportation Security Administration officers ahead of us. "Go ahead, honey," David urged, his hand resting on the small of my back. He pushed me slightly forward toward the metal detector. "Put your bag on the belt. Let us get through this so we can relax in the lounge." His touch made my skin crawl, but I offered him a bright, oblivious smile. "Of course, darling." I lifted my heavy black suitcase and placed it squarely onto the gray rubber belt of the X-ray machine. Right next to my bag sat Sienna's luggage. It was a pristine Louis Vuitton rolling suitcase, screaming of money she did not earn on a secretary's salary. Sienna stood there chewing a piece of mint gum, looking profoundly bored and annoyed that she had to endure the security process with the general public even in the priority lane. As my bag rolled forward, the atmosphere at the checkpoint suddenly shifted. A customs officer walked into our lane leading a German shepherd. The dog was alert, its nose twitching as it worked its way down the line of passengers and their carry-on items. David practically vibrated with excitement. He tried to mask it with a look of mild irritation, but I saw the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. Last night, while he thought I was fast asleep, I had watched him slice open the internal lining of my checked luggage. I had watched him carefully wedge a vacuum-sealed plastic package wrapped tightly in black duct tape deep into the framework of my bag. He had packed enough synthetic narcotics into my suitcase to ensure I would be locked away in a foreign prison for the rest of my natural life. It was a brilliant, ruthless strategy. With me rotting in an overseas jail cell, he could easily file for divorce, seize all our marital assets, cash out the life insurance policies, under the guise of legal hardship, and vanish with Sienna. He would play the role of the devastated, betrayed husband whose wife turned out to be a secret criminal. But David made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot that I make a living finding things that people try to hide. I stepped through the metal detector. The machine remained silent. No red lights, no beeping alarms. I walked to the other side and turned back to watch the show. Section 2, 1,000 words. The conveyor belt hummed loudly as my black suitcase emerged from the X-ray tunnel. The TSA officer staring at the monitor did not even blink. He let my bag roll straight down the metal rollers toward me. I reached out, grabbed the handle of my bag, and pulled it off the belt. I looked up and met David's eyes. The color instantly drained from his face. His confident, expectant smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. He stared at my suitcase as if it had magically transformed into a ghost. He looked at the X-ray monitor, then back at me, his mouth opening slightly. He knew the package he had planted was massive. There was absolutely no way it could have passed through an airport security scanner without lighting up the screens and triggering a massive lockdown. David swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the security area, searching for the trap he had so carefully laid. That was when the German Shepherd snapped to attention. The dog bypassed me entirely. It trotted straight past David, ignoring his expensive leather briefcase. Instead, the dog lunged toward the conveyor belt, its nose pressing aggressively against the expensive canvas of Sienna's Louis Vuitton bag. The dog let out a sharp, commanding bark and sat down firmly right next to her luggage. Sienna stopped chewing her gum. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in deep annoyance. "Excuse me?" she snapped at the canine handler. "Get your dog away from my bag. It sheds. And this is designer." The handler did not apologize. He immediately signaled to the other officers. "We have a positive alert," he announced loudly. Suddenly, the mundane hum of the airport security line shattered. 3 armed officers materialized out of nowhere, completely surrounding the conveyor belt. A supervisor with a stern face stepped forward, pointing a gloved hand directly at Sienna. "Ma'am, step away from the luggage and keep your hands where we can see them." Sienna let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly believing this was just a ridiculous misunderstanding. "You have got to be kidding me. Do you have any idea who I work for?" "David, tell them this is a mistake." She turned to David for backup, but David was no longer functioning as a confident corporate executive. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He stared at Sienna's designer bag with wide, terrified eyes, his brain finally putting the pieces together. I stood 10 feet away, leaning casually against a metal pillar. I took another slow sip of my vanilla latte. The coffee was perfectly sweet, contrasting beautifully with the bitter panic flooding the space between my husband and his mistress. "Mom, the TS, a supervisor," said, his voice dropping an octave as he pulled Sienna's bag to a heavy metal inspection table. "Are you traveling alone today? Did you pack this bag yourself?" "Yes, I packed it myself," Sienna said, her voice rising with entitlement. "And I demand that you be careful." The officer unzipped the main compartment. He did not bother looking at her folded silk dresses or her expensive cosmetics. He ran his hands directly along the bottom frame of the suitcase. I watched his fingers trace the internal lining pressing against the rigid structure. He found the slight irregularity in the fabric. With a swift motion, he pulled out a small utility knife and sliced the lining open. David let out a choked, breathless sound. He took a half step backward, his instinct to flee battling with his sheer paralysis. The officer reached deep into the hidden cavity of the bag. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a heavy brick-sized package wrapped entirely in black duct tape. Sienna's face went completely slack. The entitled irritation vanished from her features, replaced by a pale, trembling horror. She stared at the black package as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I do not know what that is. That is not mine." The officer did not answer. He used his knife to cut a small slit in the tape, revealing the tightly packed, vacuum-sealed bags of white powder inside. He wiped a small testing swab against the substance and placed it into a chemical analyzer. 5 seconds later, the liquid in the vial turned a bright, undeniable blue. "Positive for heavy narcotics," the officer stated. Sienna began to scream. It was a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the terminal. No. No, someone put that there. David. David, help me. Tell them I do not know anything about this. David could not help her. David could barely breathe. He stared at the package of drugs he had personally purchased and planted the night before. He looked away from Sienna and slowly turned his head to look at me. I did not break eye contact. I did not look scared and I did not look surprised. I just offered him a very small, very cold smile. In that moment, David finally understood. He realized that his naive, obedient wife had found his secret stash in the middle of the night. He realized that while he was busy dreaming of his new life, I had sliced open Sienna's bag and relocated his deadly cargo. David opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a single word, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. A deep, booming voice cut through Sienna's hysterical screaming. "Well now," a voice said. "Looks like we have a major problem here." David spun around, coming face to face with the Customs and Border Protection team that had just marched into the security zone. Leading the squad was a tall, heavily muscled African-American officer in a crisp uniform. The gold captain bars gleamed on his collar. It was Jamal, my sister Rachel's husband, my brother-in-law, and the absolute last person David ever wanted to see standing between him and the airport exit. How did my husband, a respected pharmaceutical executive, end up sweating under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of Terminal 5 while my brother-in-law prepared to read him his rights? To understand the poetry of this moment, we have to rewind exactly 3 months. That was when the man I loved died, and the monster wearing his face finally slipped his mask. It started on a rainy Tuesday in October. Our marriage had been running cold for a year, filled with unspoken tension, and David constantly working late. I was sitting at our kitchen island reviewing our joint bank statements. As a forensic accountant, numbers speak to me louder than words. I had noticed minor anomalies. Cash withdrawals that made no sense. Dinners at upscale steakhouses when David claimed he was eating stale sandwiches in the boardroom. When I confronted him that night, the air in the room turned to ice. He did not yell. He did something much worse. He walked over, placed his hands heavily on my shoulders, and looked at me with deep manufactured pity. "You are just imagining things, Claire," he whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have been so stressed with your own job lately. You are losing your grip." That phrase, "you are losing your grip." He deployed it constantly over the next few weeks. If I asked about a strange perfume scent on his jacket, I was losing my grip. If I questioned why he changed his phone passcode, I was losing my grip. The psychological pain was a slow, suffocating weight. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if my mind was actually fracturing. He isolated me, making me feel entirely dependent on his version of reality. He wanted me weak, doubtful, and blind. But he forgot one crucial detail about what I do for a living. I tear apart corporate fraud for breakfast. I do not stay blind for long. Instead of breaking down, I woke up. I stopped asking him questions and started asking the data. While David slept soundly beside me, believing he had successfully crushed my spirit, I took my laptop into the guest room and went to work. I did not cry. I audited. I bypassed the superficial joint accounts and dug into his corporate expense reports, cross-referencing public records and hidden shell companies I suspected he might use. The numbers painted a vivid, undeniable picture of betrayal. I found receipts for a luxury boutique in Paris charging $20,000 for a diamond tennis bracelet. I found reservations for weekend getaways at five-star resorts in Aspen. And weaving through this trail of financial breadcrumbs was one recurring name: Sienna. His 28-year-old executive secretary. The girl who always smiled too widely at company holiday parties. The pain of the infidelity was a sharp knife to the chest, but the financial irregularities I uncovered next were a bomb waiting to detonate. I realized David was not just cheating on me, he was siphoning massive amounts of capital from his pharmaceutical company. The lavish gifts for Sienna were a mere fraction of the missing funds. He was embezzling millions. Knowing this, I did what any rational woman trained in financial warfare would do. I smiled. I cooked his favorite meals. I kissed his cheek when he left for work. I became the perfect oblivious wife while I silently built an ironclad dossier against him. Then came the trap. 2 weeks ago, David walked through our front door holding a glossy travel brochure. He had a wide, boyish grin on his face, the kind he used when we first started dating. He announced he had booked us first-class tickets to the Maldives. A romantic getaway just for the two of us, he claimed, to save our marriage and reconnect. He held my hands and delivered a heartfelt speech about how much he loved me and how he wanted to make things right. I almost bought the performance until he dropped the caveat. He casually mentioned that Sienna would be flying out on the same flight with us. According to David, she urgently needed to handle a layover meeting in London for the corporate board before heading back to Chicago. It was the most absurd, flimsy excuse I had ever heard. Bringing your mistress on a flight meant to save your marriage was not just cruel, it was calculated. My internal alarms blared. I knew David. He was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to risk an awkward confrontation at 30,000 feet just to keep his girlfriend close. He wanted her there for a specific reason. This was not a vacation. It was a setup. He was planning something massive, something that required me to be far away from American soil, and he needed Sienna as his accomplice. Every time he kissed my forehead and told me how excited he was for our trip, that haunting phrase echoed in my mind. "You are losing your grip, Claire." I packed my bags with deliberate care, playing the role of the eager, clueless wife perfectly. I knew I was walking into a trap, but I also knew I held the ultimate advantage. He thought I was blind, but I saw every single string he was pulling. I was ready for whatever he planned to throw at me. I zipped the suitcase shut, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the heavy silence of our bedroom. David did not even look up from his phone. He stood by the window, his thumbs flying across the screen, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He thought I was subdued. He thought his months of psychological torture had finally broken me into a compliant, unquestioning shell of a woman. To understand how I became this cold, calculating version of myself, standing over a suitcase that would soon become the centerpiece of his destruction, you have to understand the pure hell he put me through. The realization of his affair and his embezzlement did not happen overnight. It was preceded by a systematic, ruthless campaign to destroy my mind. It all peaked on a suffocating Friday evening 3 months prior. I had just wrapped up a massive investigation at my firm, tearing apart the financial records of a corrupt supply chain company. I came home exhausted, my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets. I walked into our dining room hoping for a quiet dinner with my husband. Instead, I found David sitting at the head of the oak table swirling a glass of scotch. His posture was rigid. The atmosphere in the room was dense like the air right before a thunderstorm. I had confronted him that evening about a discrepancy I found by accident. A simple alert on our shared credit card for a $2,000 charge at a boutique downtown. I asked him gently, thinking perhaps he had bought me a surprise gift. David set his glass down. The sound of the heavy crystal hitting the wood felt like a gavel striking a block. He looked at me not with guilt, but with a deeply unsettling mask of pity. "There is no charge, Claire," he said softly. His voice was smooth, coated in a terrifyingly convincing layer of concern. "I checked the statement this morning. You must have read it wrong." I knew what I saw. I pulled out my phone to show him the alert, but the notification was gone. The banking app showed no such transaction. He had already logged in and wiped the alert, moving funds to cover his tracks. I stared at the screen, my heart accelerating. "I know I saw it, David. I know I did." He stood up, walked slowly over to me, and placed his large, warm hands heavily on my shoulders. He looked down into my eyes with a gaze that made me feel entirely transparent. "You spend all day hunting for criminals, Claire," he whispered. "You spend 70 hours a week digging through financial filth looking for lies. Now you are bringing that paranoia into our home. You are seeing ghosts where there are none. You are turning our marriage into an interrogation." I tried to step back, but his grip tightened just enough to keep me in place. "You are just imagining things, Claire." he said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic hush. You are losing your grip. You are losing your grip. Those 5 words became the soundtrack of my daily life. He weaponized my career against me. Every time I noticed a flaw in his stories, every time I caught him in a lie about his whereabouts, he threw my profession back in my face. He told me the stress of forensic accounting was giving me paranoid delusions. The gaslighting escalated from financial discrepancies to everyday realities. I would leave my car keys on the kitchen counter, and an hour later, they would be gone. I would find them hidden inside a drawer in the guest bathroom. When I panicked, David would shake his head, wearing that same mask of profound pity. You put them there, Claire. Do not you remember? You are losing your grip. He started canceling my social plans, texting my friends from my phone while I was in the shower, claiming I was too exhausted or feeling under the weather. When my friends stopped calling, he convinced me that they were pulling away because my behavior had become erratic. He isolated me entirely, building an invisible cage around my mind. I stopped sleeping. I walked through my own home like a stranger, constantly second-guessing my own memories, my own vision, my own sanity. I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning, staring at my pale face and dark, hollow eyes, wondering if my husband was right, wondering if my demanding career had finally shattered my perception of reality. You are losing your grip, Claire. The phrase echoed in the shower. It echoed in the silence of my morning commute. It echoed every time he kissed my forehead and told me I needed to seek psychiatric help. He was meticulously laying the groundwork. If I ever tried to accuse him of anything, he had already painted a masterpiece of a narrative. I was the overworked, unstable, paranoid wife. He was the patient, suffering husband. No one would believe a word I said. But David made a fatal error. He pushed me too far into the dark. When you push a woman who dismantles lies for a living into a corner, she does not stay blind. She adapts to the darkness. One Tuesday morning, I found a receipt for a luxury hotel stay crumpled in the pocket of his tailored suit. I did not ask him about it. I did not confront him. I held that small, damning piece of paper, and the fog in my mind instantly evaporated. The paralyzing self-doubt was replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. I was not crazy. I was being hunted. That realization was the catalyst. The victim he had carefully crafted died that morning, and the forensic accountant resurrected. From that second forward, I stopped arguing. I agreed with his gaslighting. I played the part of the fragile, broken wife. I let him believe his psychological warfare had succeeded while I secretly turned my professional skills toward his life. I watched him by the window, now entirely unaware that the woman zipping her suitcase was no longer his prey. I had let him think I was losing my grip just so I could wrap my hands tightly around his throat. The transformation did not happen with a scream. It happened in absolute silence. Once David left for the office that Tuesday, leaving me alone with the crumpled hotel receipt I had found in his suit, I walked into my home office and locked the door. I sat at my desk, booted up my custom encrypted workstation, and cracked my knuckles. The fragile, paranoid wife stayed outside that door. The woman who sat in the ergonomic chair was a predator in her natural habitat. David was a vice president of finance, which meant he thought he was the smartest man in any room regarding money. But corporate finance and forensic accounting are 2 entirely different beasts. He knew how to allocate budgets and project quarterly earnings. I knew how to peel back layers of shell corporations, untangle offshore wire transfers, and follow the microscopic digital footprints that arrogant men always leave behind. His first mistake was underestimating my skill set. His second mistake was using our home Wi-Fi network to access his hidden life. I started with the receipt. It was from a boutique hotel in downtown Chicago, a place known for discreet, high-end clientele. The date matched a Thursday night when David had claimed he was locked in a grueling board meeting until 2 in the morning. I logged into our internet service provider portal. David had changed his phone passcode, but he had never bothered to secure the router handling traffic from his personal devices. I pulled the network logs from that Thursday. It did not take long to find the IP addresses associated with a secondary banking portal, one completely detached from our joint accounts. He was using a boutique wealth management bank. Security there was tight, but David was predictable. He used variations of his childhood street name and his college fraternity graduation year for everything. Within 45 minutes, I had breached his hidden digital vault. When the dashboard loaded, the sheer volume of the numbers staring back at me made the breath catch in my throat. This was not just a secret account for buying occasional flowers or booking cheap motels. This was a parallel universe. I exported the transaction history into a massive spreadsheet and let my fingers fly across the keyboard, running pivot tables, categorizing expenditures, and tracing routing numbers. The data painted a masterpiece of betrayal in high definition. There were the luxury hotel charges, 3 nights in Aspen at a ski resort that required a minimum spend of $5,000 a night, a charge for a private helicopter charter to the Hamptons, and the jewelry. The receipt for the $20,000 diamond tennis bracelet in Paris was just the beginning. I found invoices for emerald earrings, custom Cartier necklaces, and a vintage Rolex watch. He was spending money with the reckless abandon of a lottery winner, bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars into a life I was entirely excluded from. But who was wearing the diamonds? I cross-referenced the dates of the Aspen trip with his corporate travel itinerary. The flight records were heavily redacted on his end, but I accessed the airline booking patterns using a backdoor search methodology I utilized for corporate audits. 2 first-class tickets were booked under his corporate card, later reimbursed by this hidden account. The second passenger name was clearly visible in the raw data: Sienna. The name hit me like a physical blow, yet it made perfect, sickening sense. Sienna. His 28-year-old executive secretary. The girl who always greeted me with an overly enthusiastic smile and a high-pitched voice whenever I visited the office. The girl who sent us a lovely fruit basket for our wedding anniversary. I closed my eyes and pictured her pristine manicured nails and her designer clothes that always seemed just a little too expensive for her salary. She was not just fetching his coffee. She was wearing the Cartier necklaces. She was drinking champagne in the Hamptons. A lesser woman would have taken screenshots, printed the pages, and thrown them in his face the moment he walked through the door. A lesser woman would have screamed, demanded a divorce, and fought over the house. But I was not looking for a messy divorce. The deeper I dug into the spreadsheet, the more I realized that infidelity was merely a symptom of a much larger disease. The math simply did not add up. David made a lucrative salary, but not enough to sustain this level of unhinged luxury without draining our marital assets, which remained untouched. The money in this hidden account was coming from external wire transfers routed through 3 different shell companies registered in Delaware. I spent the next 48 hours barely sleeping, fueled by black coffee and a burning icy rage. I traced the Delaware LLCs back to their origin. They were vendor accounts tied directly to his pharmaceutical conglomerate. David was creating phantom supply chain invoices, approving them as vice president of finance, and funneling the corporate funds directly into his hidden wealth management account. He was not just a cheating husband. He was a corporate embezzler committing massive federal fraud. When I finally leaned back in my chair, staring at the completed flowchart of his crimes, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. The tears were gone. The self-doubt was obliterated. He had tried to convince me I was losing my mind, but my mind had never been sharper. I decided right then and there to weaponize my pain. I became a ghost in my own home. When David returned from work that evening, complaining about his stressful day, I greeted him with a warm, sympathetic smile. I took his coat, I poured his scotch, I listened to his lies with wide, supportive eyes. Whenever he deployed his favorite gaslighting tactics, deliberately moving my keys or denying conversations we definitely had, I played my part flawlessly. I let my voice tremble. I apologized for my failing memory. I agreed that my job was making me too stressed and paranoid. I gave him exactly what he wanted: a broken, compliant, oblivious wife. Behind his back, I was systematically backing up every single document, every wire transfer, every fraudulent invoice onto a highly encrypted offline server. I built an ironclad dossier that would not just guarantee me a favorable divorce settlement, but would guarantee him a long, brutal sentence in a federal penitentiary. I watched him text Sienna under the dinner table, and instead of feeling heartbreak, I felt the cold, thrilling anticipation of a hunter watching a wolf walk willingly into a steel trap. He thought he was the mastermind controlling the board. He had no idea I had already rigged the entire game. Section 5, 1,000 words. The charade continued for exactly 3 weeks before David finally made his move. It was a Friday evening. I was in the kitchen slicing vegetables for a roast, maintaining the illusion of domestic normalcy. The front door opened and David walked in, radiating an energy that immediately put me on high alert. He was vibrating with a manic, manufactured excitement. He walked straight into the kitchen, wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, and kissed the side of my neck. I forced my muscles to relax, leaning back into his embrace, while my mind raced to calculate what he was playing at. He spun me around and slapped a glossy, heavy-stock travel brochure onto the marble island. The cover featured an overwater bungalow suspended above a crystal-clear turquoise ocean. The Maldives, he announced, his voice practically singing. I booked us 2 first-class tickets for next Thursday. We are spending 10 days at a private island resort, just you, me, and the Indian Ocean. I stared at the brochure in calculated shock. The Maldives, David. That is incredibly expensive. What about your quarterly closeouts? He waved his hand dismissively, pulling me into another tight hug. The closeouts can wait. You cannot. We have been struggling, Claire. I know I have been distant, and I know you have been dealing with so much stress and anxiety lately. I want to save our marriage. I want to take you away from all of this so we can reconnect and remember why we fell in love. It was a masterful performance. If I had not spent the last month tracing his embezzlement scheme and reading the luxury hotel receipts for his 28-year-old mistress, I might have cried tears of joy. Instead, I let my eyes well up with fake gratitude. I hugged him back, burying my face in his chest so he would not see my freezing gaze. "Thank you," I whispered. "This is exactly what we need." He pulled back, keeping his hands on my shoulders, and offered a slightly apologetic smile. "There is just one tiny catch," he said smoothly. "The flights I booked have an overnight layover in London. The European Board of Directors threw a massive emergency meeting on the schedule for Friday morning. I told them I could not make it, but they insisted someone from the executive team be there to hand over the physical financial projections. So I am sending Sienna." The name hung in the air between us. Sienna. My husband was taking me on a luxury vacation to save our marriage, and he was bringing his mistress on the exact same flight. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Sending a secretary to London to deliver physical projections to a board of directors in the era of encrypted digital files was an excuse so flimsy it bordered on insulting. He was treating me like an idiot. But I remembered the first rule of forensic accounting. When the suspect hands you a fabricated ledger, you do not throw it back at them. You accept it, smile, and use it to build their cage. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice light and entirely devoid of suspicion. "Will she be sitting with us?" David laughed, shaking his head. "Goodness, no. She is in coach. We are in first class. She will grab her bags in London, head to the corporate office, and we will catch our connecting flight to Mail. You will not notice she is there, I promise." I nodded, offering him a bright, trusting smile. "Well, if it keeps your job secure and gets us to the beach, I suppose it is fine." He kissed my forehead, calling me the most understanding wife in the world, and went upstairs to shower. I stayed in the kitchen staring at the glossy brochure. The Maldives was an extradition nightmare. It was a country where an American woman could easily disappear, or where a fatal accident could occur far away from the jurisdiction of United States law enforcement. But David was not the type to get his hands dirty with physical violence. He was a finance guy. He dealt in setups, leverage, and paper trails. If he was bringing Sienna, this was not a murder plot. It was a frame job. He needed me out of the picture permanently, and he needed a witness or an accomplice to help him execute it while in transit. The tension thickened like tar over the next 5 days. I went about my routine, packing my bags with deliberate care. I pulled my sleek black suitcase from the storage closet and began filling it with swimsuits, light dresses, and sunscreen. Every time I placed an item into the luggage, my mind ran through a dozen different worst-case scenarios. I knew he was going to use this luggage. It was the only variable in this trip he could control entirely. I made sure to leave the suitcase open in the corner of our bedroom, an inviting vulnerable target for whatever he was planning. David played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly that week. He brought home my favorite takeout. He rubbed my shoulders when I complained of a headache. He kept using that patronizing tone, telling me how good this trip would be for my mental health. "You will feel so much better once we get out of the city, Claire. You will finally be able to let go of all this paranoia. You will find your grip again." Each time he said it, I filed it away in the vault of my mind, turning his psychological abuse into pure, refined fuel. As Wednesday evening approached, the air in our house grew heavy with unspoken anticipation. I watched David casually pack his own designer luggage, whistling a cheerful tune. He was so confident in his superiority. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone, his company, his mistress, and most of all, his naive wife. He had no idea that I had already secured the evidence of his offshore accounts. He had no idea that I knew every detail of his illicit life. As I placed my favorite silk gown into my black suitcase, I felt a strange thrill coursing through my veins. The trap was perfectly set, but he was the one walking blindly into the steel jaws. I closed the zipper halfway, leaving it perfectly accessible. The stage was ready. Tomorrow we would head to Chicago O'Hare. Tomorrow the long execution would begin, and I would be the only one holding the axe. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted from 1:59 to 2 in the morning. The harsh red glow illuminated the contours of our bedroom, casting long shadows across the floor. I lay perfectly still on my side of the California king bed facing the wall. I regulated my breathing, drawing air in through my nose and pushing it out through my mouth in a slow cadence. I had to mimic the deep slumber of a wife who believed her husband was taking her on a romantic getaway. My eyes were closed, but my senses were heightened to an excruciating level. I was a wire-pulled taut vibrating with anticipation. The mattress shifted. The sudden absence of David's weight sent a cold rush of air against my spine. I kept my breathing steady. I did not flinch or move a single muscle. I opened my eyes just a fraction of an inch, peering through my eyelashes into the dimly lit room. David stood beside the bed, silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through the blinds. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring down at me, checking to see if his movement had disturbed me. I let out a soft, sleepy sigh and shifted my head slightly into the pillow, playing the part of the exhausted woman he believed me to be. He turned away satisfied. He moved with a practiced, predatory silence. He crossed the room and stepped into his walk-in closet. I heard the faint rustle of fabric, followed by the metallic click of his personal floor safe being unlocked. When he emerged a minute later, he was holding something substantial. It was a rectangular block, roughly the size of a thick textbook, entirely encased in matte black duct tape. Even in the dim light, the package looked heavy and dense. It looked exactly like the kind of contraband laid out on metal tables during federal drug busts. He carried the black brick over to the corner of the room where my sleek black suitcase sat open and waiting. My heart hammered against my rib cage, a frantic, violent rhythm I was terrified he could hear from across the room. "You are losing your grip, Claire." The phrase echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind, loud and mocking. This was the exact moment the reality of his psychological warfare fully materialized into physical danger. He was not just gaslighting me to cover up a cheap office affair. He was orchestrating my absolute annihilation. David knelt beside my suitcase. He reached into the pocket of his sweatpants and pulled out a small, sharp utility blade. I watched in horrific fascination as my husband carefully peeled back the clothes I had packed just hours earlier. He found the zipper at the base of the luggage shell, the one that accessed the internal structural lining. He unzipped it halfway, but the gap was not wide enough to accommodate the bulky black package. Without a second of hesitation, David pressed the utility blade against the heavy nylon fabric. He sliced the lining open. The tearing sound was faint, a soft hiss of breaking threads, but to me it sounded like a gunshot. It was the sound of my marriage being permanently severed. He wedged the heavy black taped bag deep into the cavity between the hard plastic shell and the fabric lining. He pressed it flat, maneuvering the corners to ensure it did not create any suspicious bulges. Once the package was perfectly concealed, he smoothed the sliced lining back into place and meticulously repacked my dresses and swimsuits over the hidden compartment. He zipped the main compartment shut, patting the top of the suitcase with a sickeningly triumphant gesture. "You are losing your grip, Claire." The voice in my head was deafening now. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me like freezing water. He was not just planning to divorce me and leave me for his young secretary. He was sending me to a foreign prison in a jurisdiction known for zero-tolerance drug policies. A place where an American woman would disappear into a nightmare of concrete and steel. If his plan succeeded, I would be flagged at an international checkpoint. I would be dragged into a fluorescent-lit interrogation room, screaming my innocence, while foreign authorities pulled a brick of heavy narcotics from my personal luggage. David would stand by playing the horrified husband. He would shake his head in disbelief, telling the authorities that his wife had been acting erratically, that she was losing her grip. He would use the mental instability he had manufactured to seal my fate. I would be locked away for decades. He would return to Chicago a tragic hero, free to inherit my life insurance, our home, and his stolen corporate millions alongside his mistress. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a sociopathic calculation that defied basic human empathy. He wanted me to spend the rest of my life rotting in a cage, questioning my own sanity. He stretched his arms over his head, letting out a quiet, satisfied exhale. The executioner had laid the trap. He walked back to his side of the bed, slipped under the duvet, and settled into the pillows. Within 10 minutes, his breathing deepened into a steady rhythm. He slept like a baby. He slept like a man who did not have the weight of a ruined life on his conscience. He had just signed my death warrant with a utility blade and a roll of black duct tape, yet his chest rose and fell in perfect harmony. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I did not cry. The fragile, paranoid wife he had tried to create was entirely dead. The woman lying next to him in the dark was entirely different. My grief had crystallized into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly precise. I waited another 30 minutes to ensure he was fully submerged in deep sleep. The house was dead silent. I slowly pushed the duvet off my shoulders. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The game was no longer his to control. The midnight betrayal was complete, and now it was my turn to move. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet as I stepped away from the bed. I did not look back at David. His deep, rhythmic breathing filled the room, a sound that once brought me comfort, but now only cemented my resolve. I moved with the silent, practiced grace of a shadow crossing the expansive master bedroom toward the corner where my sleek black suitcase lay waiting. The moonlight spilled through the plantation shutters, illuminating the luggage like a crime scene exhibit. I knelt beside the suitcase, my knees pressing into the plush wool rug. My hands hovered over the zipper. I had to be meticulous. Every movement required the precision of a surgeon operating on a volatile patient. I slowly pulled the zipper open millimeter by millimeter, ensuring the metal teeth made absolutely no sound. The scent of my expensive floral perfume wafted up from the neatly folded clothes, a stark contrast to the betrayal buried beneath them. I carefully lifted the top layer of my silk dresses and linen trousers, setting them aside in the exact configuration they had been packed. I reached the bottom lining of the suitcase. My fingers traced the nylon fabric until they found the fresh, jagged slice David had made just minutes prior. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands remained entirely steady. I slipped my fingers into the dark cavity between the hard polycarbonate shell and the fabric lining. The package was dense and unyielding. It felt like a block of solid concrete. I gripped the edges of the black duct tape and slowly worked it out of the tight space. The friction of the tape against the nylon produced a faint scraping noise, causing me to freeze. I held my breath, listening intently. David's snoring hitched for a second, then resumed its steady cadence. I exhaled a slow, controlled stream of air and pulled the package entirely free. It weighed at least 3 pounds. Holding it in my hands, the reality of my husband's sociopathy became a physical weight. I cradled the black brick against my chest and stood up. I bypassed our ensuite bathroom, knowing the bright lights and proximity to the bed were too risky. Instead, I glided silently out into the hallway and made my way to my home office on the opposite end of the second floor. I stepped inside, closed the heavy mahogany door, and engaged the deadbolt with a soft, definitive click. I turned on the small desk lamp, casting a concentrated pool of warm yellow light across my polished glass desk. I set the black package down in the center of the illuminated circle. The duct tape was wrapped in overlapping chaotic layers designed to make tampering obvious. But forensic accountants are trained to dismantle complex structures without leaving a trace. I opened my desk drawer and retrieved a specialized crafting scalpel I used for precision document binding. I sat down, leaning closely over the package. I examined the seams of the tape, looking for the terminal edge where David had finished his wrapping. I found the edge hidden on the underside. Holding my breath, I slid the razor-sharp tip of the scalpel beneath the adhesive. I applied a microscopic amount of pressure, slicing upward in a perfectly straight line. The thick tape parted cleanly. I peeled back the heavy black layers one by one, working with excruciating patience to preserve the sticky integrity of the adhesive so it could be seamlessly resealed. Beneath the duct tape was a thick layer of industrial vacuum-sealed plastic. Through the transparent material, I saw it. White powder. It was packed incredibly tight, compressed into a solid, chalky mass. My blood ran cold, chilling me down to the marrow of my bones. I am a financial investigator, not a narcotics expert, but the sheer volume of the synthetic substance staring back at me was unmistakable. This was not a recreational amount. This was a trafficking quantity. My mind instantly calculated the legal ramifications. The Maldives operates under strict Islamic law. International transit through London or Dubai with this amount of synthetic narcotics carries mandatory draconian minimums. David was not just trying to get me arrested. He was sentencing me to a lifetime in a brutal foreign prison. He wanted me locked in a concrete cell, stripped of my rights, my career, and my freedom, completely unable to defend myself, while he played the grieving husband back in Chicago. The sheer breathtaking malice required to execute such a plan made my hands tremble for a brief, fleeting second. I stared at the powder, my mind racing through his strategy. But something bothered me. The package was thick, but the weight distribution felt slightly uneven when I carried it down the hall. My forensic instincts flared. You never look just at the surface numbers. You always look at what is buried beneath the ledger. I pressed my thumbs against the tightly sealed plastic, probing the dense block of powder. The surface was hard, but as I ran my fingers along the bottom edge, I felt a distinct, unnatural bulge. It was small, rectangular, and entirely rigid. It was not a clump of narcotics, it was hardware. Using the scalpel, I made a tiny, imperceptible incision at the very corner of the vacuum seal. The hiss of escaping air was barely audible. I manipulated the compressed powder, shifting the white mass just enough to push the hidden object toward the opening. A small black object slid out of the powder and hit the glass surface of my desk with a faint clink. It was a USB drive, B. The device was sleek, heavily ruggedized, and bore the logo of a military-grade hardware encryption manufacturer. It was the kind of drive used by top-tier executives to transport sensitive trade secrets across hostile borders. I stared at the device, my analytical mind snapping the final puzzle pieces together. David was a mastermind of corporate finance, but he suffered from the ultimate flaw of arrogant men. He wanted a clean sweep. He did not just want to frame me for drug smuggling. He was framing me for his corporate embezzlement. If the authorities detained me at the airport, they would seize the drugs and confiscate the USB drive as evidence. When they cracked the encryption, they would find the financial ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital footprints of the $8 million missing from his pharmaceutical company, all neatly packaged in my luggage. The authorities would conclude that I was the mastermind, the paranoid, unstable wife who embezzled millions and tried to flee the country with a bag full of narcotics. David would be completely exonerated, a tragic victim of his wife's hidden criminal empire. He would keep the actual money safe in an offshore account, clear his name at the company, and walk away completely untouched. I picked up the USB drive. It was cold to the touch, a deadly digital weapon designed to bury my reputation alongside my freedom. I brushed a few specks of white powder off the metallic casing. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously evil, that it transcended anger. It became absolute terrifying clarity. He wanted a war of information. He wanted to use digital forensics to destroy me. He had brought a knife to a gunfight. I gripped the USB drive tightly in my palm, booting up my heavily encrypted laptop. It was time to see exactly how much rope my husband had given me to hang him with. The cold metal of the USB drive slid into the port of my heavily modified laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh pale blue light across my face. A sleek minimalist password prompt materialized in the center of the display. This was military-grade encryption, the kind designed to wipe the drive entirely if the wrong password was entered 10 consecutive times. David had purchased top-tier security, but he suffered from the fatal arrogance of a man who believed his wife was technologically illiterate. He thought I spent my days balancing simple ledgers. He did not realize my daily routine involved dismantling the encrypted financial fortresses of corrupt billionaires. I did not waste my limited attempts guessing his childhood pets or his favorite scotch. Instead, I launched a proprietary decryption protocol I had engineered years ago for penetrating offshore tax havens. Lines of green code cascaded down my screen in a rapid, mesmerizing waterfall. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, sipping a glass of ice water, watching my software violently dismantle his expensive digital lock. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the rhythmic low hum of my laptop fan. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. I kept one ear tuned to the hallway, listening for the creak of the floorboards that would signal David waking up to find an empty bed. He was deeply asleep, sedated by the sheer confidence of his own sociopathy. 7 minutes later, a sharp, satisfying click echoed from the computer speakers. The encryption barrier collapsed. The drive mounted successfully onto my desktop. I opened the main directory. There were 3 distinct folders neatly organized with the clinical precision David applied to everything. The first folder was labeled with the name of a dormant pharmaceutical research project. I clicked it open. A massive, complex spreadsheet populated the screen. This was the master ledger. My eyes scanned the rows and columns, instantly translating the raw data into a horrific narrative. It perfectly mirrored the preliminary embezzlement trail I had uncovered weeks ago. But the scale was exponentially larger than I had calculated. David had not just siphoned a few $100,000 for luxury trips with Sienna. He had systematically bled his company dry over a period of 4 years. He created an elaborate network of phantom suppliers, generating fake invoices for raw chemical materials that never existed. The funds were approved by his own department, paid out to Delaware shell corporations, and immediately wire transferred to a labyrinth of offshore holding accounts. I highlighted the final column and ran the sum. The total stolen assets amounted to exactly $8 million. I opened the second folder. This one contained a series of text documents filled with seemingly random strings of words. Seed phrases. David had not left the $8 million sitting in vulnerable international banks. He had meticulously converted the stolen fiat currency into untraceable cryptocurrency. He had broken the fortune down and stored it across multiple cold wallets. The digital keys required to access those wallets were sitting right here on this drive. With these phrases, he could access his stolen empire from a laptop anywhere on the planet. From a private villa in the Maldives, from a non-extradition paradise. The sheer scale of his greed was breathtaking, but it was the contents of the third folder that made the blood freeze in my veins. The folder was simply titled Archive. I opened it and found a collection of fabricated digital evidence. There were drafted emails manipulated to look as though they had been sent from my personal Internet Protocol address. The messages were directed to shady overseas chemical suppliers discussing the logistics of moving synthetic narcotics. There was even a forged digital confession written in my tone, expressing deep regret for letting my financial greed push me into international drug smuggling. David had manufactured an alternate reality where I was the criminal mastermind. The totality of his plot finally locked into place, a devastatingly perfect mechanism designed to obliterate my existence. The heavy package of narcotics in my suitcase was merely the physical bait. When the airport security dogs inevitably flagged my bag, the authorities would tear it apart. They would find the massive quantity of synthetic drugs and this heavily encrypted drive. Once international cyber units cracked the drive, they would discover the $8 million corporate theft and the fabricated emails tying me to both crimes. The authorities would look at my career as a forensic accountant and conclude I possessed the exact skill set required to pull off such a massive corporate heist. They would assume I used the stolen company funds to purchase the narcotics, attempting to flee the country and start a new life. David would stand in the airport terminal playing the role of the horrified, betrayed husband. He would cooperate fully with the authorities, tearfully handing over any information they requested. I would be tried and convicted in a foreign jurisdiction known for its draconian justice system. I would be locked inside a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life, completely silenced, unable to defend myself against the mountain of digital evidence planted in my own luggage. A life sentence in a foreign prison is essentially a death sentence. Back in Chicago, David would reap the ultimate rewards. As the innocent, grieving spouse, he would maintain control of our marital estate. He would cash out my substantial life insurance policies. The pharmaceutical company, believing they had caught the rogue accountant responsible for the theft, would close their internal investigations. David's name would be completely cleared. He would wait a respectable amount of mourning time, and then he would quietly vanish. He would fly away to a beautiful sun-drenched island, with his young secretary accessing his $8 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. They would live like royalty on the ashes of my destroyed life. It was a flawless execution strategy, assuming the victim was an oblivious, trusting wife who would blindly carry a tampered suitcase into an international airport. But David had profoundly misjudged his opponent. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a pawn. He did not realize I had already flipped the entire board. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. The initial shock had entirely evaporated, replaced by an absolute glacial resolve. He wanted to destroy me with data. He wanted to use my own profession to dig my grave. I reached for my encrypted external hard drive and plugged it into the laptop. I began to copy every single file, every seed phrase, every fabricated email, and the master ledger of his $8 million theft. I was taking his ammunition. I was taking his future. I was taking his life. The transfer progress bar glowed neon green across my screen, a steady, relentless march toward 100%. I watched every single byte of David's stolen empire flow from his heavily encrypted hardware directly into my ghost server. I had set up this untraceable cloud architecture years ago for safeguarding whistleblower documents and tracking offshore corporate fraud. It was housed on servers located in jurisdictions that would never yield to a subpoena from any federal agency. Now it was holding the digital execution order for my husband. The file transfer completed with a crisp, hollow chime. I safely ejected the USB drive and pulled it from the port. It felt entirely different in my hand now. It was no longer a mystery. It was a loaded weapon. I looked down at the black brick of synthetic narcotics resting on my glass desk. A normal person, a civilian untouched by the brutal realities of the legal system, would have grabbed their smartphone immediately. They would have dialed emergency services, screaming for the police to come to the house, pointing frantically at the drugs and the sleeping husband in the master bedroom. But I am not a civilian. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my life in deposition rooms and federal courthouses watching high-priced defense attorneys twist reality until the truth is entirely unrecognizable. If I called the police right now, David would wake up, rub his eyes, and play the bewildered victim. He would look at the officers with that practiced, pitying expression. He would tell them I had been acting erratically for months. He would claim he had never seen that package before in his life. He would suggest with a trembling voice that my demanding career had finally pushed me into a psychological break, and I had somehow acquired these drugs in a manic episode. Without hard, irrefutable proof that he placed the package in my bag, the narrative would become a muddy, chaotic dispute between spouses. He had the corporate pedigree, the expensive suits, and the carefully cultivated reputation of a dedicated vice president. I would be the hysterical wife holding 3 pounds of narcotics in my own home office. The risk was simply unacceptable. David needed to be caught in a scenario where his guilt was absolute. He needed to be caught holding the bag entirely stripped of his ability to spin a fabricated story. He needed to step into a trap so perfectly engineered that even the most expensive corporate lawyers in Chicago could not save him. I would not let him negotiate a plea deal or claim ignorance. I would let his own greed and arrogance lead him to the slaughter. I picked up the USB drive and slid it back into the tiny incision I had made in the vacuum-sealed plastic. I pushed it deep into the compressed white powder, ensuring it was buried exactly where he had placed it. Next, I reached into my crafting drawer and pulled out a roll of matte black duct tape. I had purchased this specific brand for binding heavy financial dossiers. It was an exact match to the tape David had used. I worked with the steady, measured precision of a bomb technician. I wrapped the fresh tape over the incision, pressing it flat, smoothing out any microscopic air bubbles or creases. I replicated the chaotic overlapping pattern he had utilized, ensuring the visual integrity of the package remained completely undisturbed. When I finished, I held the heavy black brick under the desk lamp. It was flawless. David could inspect it closely and never suspect it had been breached, decrypted, and weaponized against him. I carried the heavy package back down the dark hallway, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The master bedroom was exactly as I had left it. The moonlight still painted long shadows across the rug. David was still snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in deep, ignorant slumber. I knelt beside my open black suitcase. I did not put the package back into the lining. That was his plan, not mine. Instead, I left the lining perfectly sliced, pushing my folded clothes back into place to make it look as though the package was still hidden underneath. I zipped the suitcase completely shut. I took the black brick and walked into my walk-in closet, hiding it deep inside my oversized leather tote bag. A bag I would be carrying right next to me during the morning commute. The decision to let his own arrogance destroy him settled over me like a heavy, comforting blanket. I was not just going to survive this. I was going to orchestrate a spectacular public annihilation. I would let him walk into the international terminal believing he was the smartest man in the world. I would let him feel the intoxicating thrill of his impending victory. And then, at the very last possible second, I would execute the ultimate game of sleight of hand. He wanted to use Sienna as a prop, a naive secretary to run away with once I was locked in a foreign cell. It was only fitting that she became the vessel for his downfall. I walked into the master bathroom and turned on the cold water tap. I splashed the freezing water onto my face, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me was unrecognizable from the devoted wife who had lived in this house for 5 years. Her eyes were dark, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. I dried my face with the towel and walked back into the bedroom. I slipped under the duvet, pulling the heavy fabric up to my shoulders. I lay a mere 2 feet away from the man who had actively planned my demise. I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of his breath. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt a profound, chilling anticipation. Chilling. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. The strategy was locked into place. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to drift into a light, calculating sleep. Tomorrow morning the sun would rise over Chicago, and I would wake up and play the role of the loving, unsuspecting wife one final time. I would smile at him over coffee. I would hold his hand in the back of the car, and I would watch him march happily toward his own absolute destruction. Morning arrived with the harsh blare of the alarm. David was already awake, moving around the bedroom with an irritating level of energy. He kissed my cheek, handed me a cup of coffee, and told me to get dressed. because our private car was waiting. I played my part beautifully. I stretched, offered a sleepy, grateful smile, and told him how excited I was. I grabbed my leather tote bag from the closet, feeling the heavy, dense weight of the black brick resting safely at the bottom, concealed beneath my laptop and a cashmere scarf. David grabbed my black suitcase, carrying it down the stairs with exaggerated care. He thought he was carrying his golden ticket. He had no idea he was carrying an empty shell. We stepped out into the crisp Chicago morning. A luxury SUV idled in our driveway. The driver stepped out to open the trunk, but David insisted on loading my black suitcase himself. He placed it gently into the back, giving it one final satisfied pat. I watched him from the curb, clutching my tote bag to my chest, masking my cold anticipation with a bright vacation-ready smile. David opened the rear passenger door for me. I slid onto the leather seat. That was when I saw her. Sienna was sitting in the front passenger seat. She turned around, flashing a brilliant, perfectly glossed smile. "Good morning, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. David mentioned it would be more efficient to share the car to the airport, since my flight to London leaves around the same time as your flight to the Maldives. I hope you do not mind. I forced my face to soften into an expression of pleasant surprise. "Not at all, Sienna," I replied, my voice steady and light. "It makes perfect sense. We are all heading to the same exact place." David slid into the back seat next to me, closing the heavy door. The SUV pulled away from the curb, beginning the journey to O'Hare International Airport. The interior of the vehicle was suffocatingly quiet at first, filled only with the soft hum of the engine. The spatial dynamic was a masterpiece of betrayal. David sat shoulder to shoulder with his wife while his mistress sat mere inches away in the front seat. I kept my eyes focused on the rearview mirror. I could see Sienna's reflection clearly. She was not looking at the road. She was looking at David. Every few minutes her eyes would dart up to the mirror, catching his gaze. A subtle mocking smirk played on her lips. She was enjoying this. She loved the thrill of sitting in the same car as the oblivious wife, sharing a secret deadly joke with the man who was about to destroy my life. David was reveling in it too. He reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. "You look beautiful this morning, Claire," he said, his thumb rubbing the back of my hand. "This trip is going to change everything for us. We are going to leave all our heavy baggage right here in Chicago and just focus on the future." The dramatic irony of his words hung in the narrow space of the SUV. He thought he was delivering a clever double entendre about leaving his marriage and me behind in a prison cell. I looked at him, squeezing his hand tightly. "I completely agree, David," I said, matching his earnest tone. "I feel lighter already." It is amazing how much better you feel when you finally get rid of the things that have been weighing you down. Sienna's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second. Her smirk widened. She thought my response was pathetic, the desperate clinging of a woman trying to save a doomed marriage. She turned her head slightly toward the passenger window, hiding a quiet scoff. "Are you ready for your big board meeting in London?" I asked Sienna, leaning forward slightly. "David says you are handling some incredibly sensitive financial projections. It must be a lot of pressure to carry all that corporate weight by yourself." Sienna shifted in her seat, adjusting her expensive designer scarf. "Oh, it is nothing I cannot handle, Claire. David trusts me implicitly with his most valuable assets. I know exactly how to execute his plans." She glanced at David in the mirror again, her eyes shining with malicious delight. David let out a low, booming laugh, patting my knee. "Sienna is a professional, Claire. She always delivers exactly what I ask for, without leaving a single trace of an error. That is why she is absolutely indispensable to my operations." They were practically high-fiving each other in front of my face. The sheer arrogance required to taunt me so openly was staggering. They felt invincible. They believed they were the predators playing with their food before the slaughter. I sat back against the leather seat, resting my hand on the leather tote bag in my lap. Through the thick material, my fingertips grazed the solid outline of the black duct tape package. "It is so important to have people you can trust," I murmured, looking out the window at the passing highway traffic. "Especially when you are dealing with things that could ruin your life if they ever got out." You really have to be careful about who is holding your baggage at the end of the day. The luxury SUV hit a slight bump on the busy interstate. David pulled his hand away to check a quick notification on his phone. "We are making very great time," he announced. "We will be at the VIP terminal in 20 minutes. The security lines there are an absolute breeze. We will all walk right through without a single hiccup today." I simply smiled at my reflection in the dark glass. He was right about one thing. Everything was about to change forever. The luxury SUV glided to a smooth halt outside the glass and steel facade of the international terminal. A uniformed porter immediately approached the vehicle, but David waved him off with a sharp, frantic gesture. He insisted on handling the luggage himself, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of my black suitcase. He hauled it out of the trunk as if it contained the crown jewels, setting it carefully on the concrete. Sienna retrieved her pristine Louis Vuitton rolling bag, the wheels gliding silently across the pavement. I stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, clutching my heavy leather tote bag tightly against my side. The black brick of narcotics rested securely at the bottom, an anchor pulling me toward the inevitable climax. We moved through the sliding glass doors and away from the chaotic masses of the main terminal. David bypassed the standard check-in counters, entirely guiding us toward the frosted glass entrance of the exclusive first-class lounge. This was a sanctuary designed for the elite, a place where the wealthy could sip espresso and drink complimentary champagne before facing the minor inconvenience of the priority security checkpoint, located just beyond the lounge exit. The heavy glass doors slid open, muting the frantic airport noise. The lounge was wrapped in an atmosphere of hushed privilege. Soft jazz played from invisible speakers. Business executives typed quietly on laptops while attendants in crisp vests circulated with silver trays. David selected a secluded seating area in the far corner flanked by tall frosted glass partitions that offered a strategic amount of privacy. He positioned my black suitcase directly against the wall, keeping it well within his line of sight. Sienna parked her designer luggage right next to my leather chair, carelessly abandoning it as she threw her trench coat over the armrest. David sat opposite me, bouncing his knee rapidly. His facade of the relaxed romantic husband was beginning to crack under the immense pressure of his own plot. He checked his watch again, then stared at the entrance to the priority security checkpoint visible through the glass walls of the lounge. He was calculating the final steps of his execution. I sat perfectly still, maintaining a serene, untroubled expression, while my mind mapped the exact geography of the room. I noted the location of the security cameras. I tracked the patrol patterns of the lounge attendants. I measured the precise distance between my chair and Sienna's luggage. 10 minutes passed in suffocating silence. The tension radiating from David was so palpable it felt like a physical weight in the air. He pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at a blank screen, and suddenly gasped in fabricated surprise. "It is the London board," he announced, his voice tight with manufactured urgency. "They must be reviewing the preliminary financial disclosures. I have to take this call before we go through security. It might take a few minutes." He stood up abruptly, pointing toward a row of soundproof glass phone booths situated on the opposite side of the lounge. "Order a mimosa, Claire," he instructed, forcing a tight smile. "I will be right back, and then we will head straight to the gate." I watched him stride away, his back rigid, a man marching toward a conversation with an empty dial tone. He stepped into the soundproof booth and turned his back to the seating area, pressing the phone to his ear in a desperate pantomime of corporate crisis. I was left alone with Sienna. She sat across from me, scrolling through her social media feed with an air of profound boredom. She did not bother making conversation. In her mind, I was already a ghost. I was a naive, disposable obstacle standing between her and a stolen fortune. She sighed heavily, locking her phone and dropping it into her purse. "I need to fix my lipstick," Sienna declared, not looking at me. "The dry air in this place is an absolute nightmare." She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her expensive silk blouse. She did not take her Louis Vuitton rolling bag with her. Why would she? She was leaving it in the care of a woman she perceived as entirely harmless. A woman who was too oblivious to notice her own husband slipping away. Sienna turned on her heel and walked confidently toward the luxury restrooms located down a short, curved hallway near the entrance of the lounge. I watched her figure disappear around the corner. I shifted my gaze back to the soundproof booth. David was still facing the wall, gesturing animatedly to an imaginary board of directors. I was completely alone. The adrenaline hit my bloodstream like a violent electrical surge. My heart slammed against my ribs with a force that threatened to shatter my chest. My vision tunneled, stripping away the soft jazz, the ambient chatter, and the clinking of champagne flutes. The entire world narrowed down to the pristine designer bag sitting exactly 14 inches from my right foot. My internal clock initiated a ruthless, unforgiving countdown. I had exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes before Sienna finished reapplying her makeup. 3 minutes before David ended his theatrical phone call. 3 minutes to execute the most dangerous transaction of my life. I did not panic. The forensic accountant took absolute control of my nervous system. I operate in fractions and tight windows in the spaces where greedy people leave themselves vulnerable. I took a deep, silent breath, flooding my lungs with oxygen. I casually shifted my body weight, sliding to the very edge of my leather chair. I unzipped the top of my oversized tote bag. I plunged my hand deep into the dark interior, pushing past my laptop and my cashmere scarf. My fingers brushed against the rough, unmistakable texture of the black duct tape. The brick of synthetic narcotics was heavy, cold, and waiting. My grip tightened around it, preparing to pull the trigger on a trap that would tear their lives apart piece by piece. The 3-minute window was closing fast. The lounge remained quiet. No one was looking in my direction. The business travelers were absorbed in their screens. The attendants were busy near the buffet. The stage was perfectly miraculously clear. I glanced one last time toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. Empty. I looked at the soundproof booth. David was still facing the wall. The countdown ticked mercilessly in my head. 2 minutes and 45 seconds remaining. The stakes had never been higher, and my hands had never been steadier. I pulled the black package free from my tote bag, keeping it low and hidden beneath the drape of my long coat. The moment of absolute destruction had officially begun. I shifted my weight off the leather armchair and slid down to the thick carpeted floor in a single fluid motion. From the perspective of the business travelers across the lounge, I simply looked like a woman reaching down to adjust her shoe. But from my vantage point, behind the frosted glass partition, I had uninhibited access to the pristine Louis Vuitton rolling bag sitting abandoned on the rug. 2 minutes and 30 seconds remained. The designer luggage was practically mocking me with its interlocking monogram pattern. Sienna had positioned the bag with the main zipper facing outward, completely unsecured. She was so convinced of her own safety, so entirely wrapped in the delusion of her upcoming tropical victory, that she had not even bothered to lock the small brass padlock dangling from the side handle. I reached out and gripped the custom gold zipper pulls. The metal was freezing cold against my skin. I pulled the zippers apart. The luxury hardware glided open with zero resistance, parting in absolute silence. The interior of Sienna's bag smelled overwhelmingly of expensive floral perfume and fresh leather. My eyes scanned the contents with the rapid, calculating efficiency of an auditor processing a physical ledger. She had packed with careless arrogance. Tangled silk camisoles lay haphazardly over designer swimwear. A velvet jewelry pouch sat brazenly near the top. I pushed my hand past her expensive garments, driving deep into the bottom framework of the suitcase. 2 minutes remaining. My fingers searched the fabric along the base of the luggage. I needed a compartment deep enough to conceal a 3-pound brick of synthetic narcotics and corporate treason. I found a secondary zipper running along the spine of the suitcase, an internal lining compartment meant for storing damp clothing or shoes. I grabbed the small plastic pull tab and ripped it open. The space inside was perfectly hollow. I lifted the black taped package from the folds of my long coat. The brick felt exponentially heavier now that it was entirely exposed. It held a life sentence. It held the $8 million David had bled from his company. It held the digital forged emails designed to bury me in a foreign prison. I did not hesitate. I shoved the heavy black package deep into the internal cavity of Sienna's designer bag. I pushed the brick flat against the hard polycarbonate spine, maneuvering the corners so they nested perfectly against the wheel wells. I pressed my palms against the heavy plastic, feeling the vacuum-sealed drugs settle into the foundation of the luggage. I smoothed the internal nylon lining over the package, ensuring no unnatural bulges protruded upward. It fit flawlessly. The burden of my husband's betrayal had officially been transferred. 1 minute and 20 seconds remaining. I grabbed the internal zipper and pulled it closed, sealing the narcotics and the encrypted USB drive securely into the darkness. I quickly rearranged her tangled silk camisoles, draping them back over the bottom lining in the exact chaotic pattern she had left them. I pulled the two gold exterior zippers together, closing the Louis Vuitton bag entirely. I adjusted the handles to match the exact angle Sienna had left them. I slid back up into my leather armchair, my heart pounding a violent rhythm against my ribs. My hands were shaking slightly from the massive adrenaline spike. I wiped my palms against the fabric of my trousers, grabbed the stem of my mimosa glass, and took a deep, grounding breath. The physical swap had taken exactly 75 seconds, 1 minute remaining. I looked across the sprawling lounge. David was still trapped inside the soundproof glass phone booth, his back turned to the seating area. He was nodding emphatically, pointing his finger and selling his fabricated corporate emergency to an empty line. He looked so powerful in his tailored suit. He had no idea his entire future had just been relocated into the luggage of the woman he was sleeping with. Then a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the ambient noise of the lounge. Click, click, click. The unmistakable sound of designer heels striking the polished marble hallway leading from the restrooms. The footsteps were moving fast, sharp and highly purposeful. My internal clock screamed. 45 seconds. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the frosted glass partitions. Someone was walking directly toward our secluded corner. I crossed my legs, adjusted the collar of my blouse, and brought the rim of the mimosa glass to my lips. I regulated my breathing, forcing my chest to rise and fall in a slow, relaxed cadence. I stared blankly at a digital departure board mounted on the far wall, the absolute picture of a bored, waiting wife. The footsteps rounded the corner. Sienna stepped into our seating area. Her lipstick was flawlessly reapplied in a vibrant, aggressive shade of red. Not a single hair was out of place. She carried herself with the arrogant strut of a woman who believed she had already won the war. She glanced downward at her Louis Vuitton bag resting on the carpet. It looked completely untouched. She had absolutely no inkling that her pristine luggage was now a ticking time bomb waiting to obliterate her life. Sienna dropped heavily into the chair across from me. She crossed her legs and picked up her phone, completely ignoring my presence. She let out a soft, theatrical sigh of inconvenience, tapping her manicured nails against her screen. "David certainly takes his time, does he not?" she murmured, her eyes glued to her device. "You would think the board could survive without him for a few hours. He works entirely too hard." I lowered my mimosa glass, letting the cool crystal rest against my knee. The irony of her statement was almost suffocating. I looked directly at her perfectly contoured face. I thought about the heavy black package resting just inches beneath her designer boots. I thought about the armed customs and border protection officers waiting on the other side of the security checkpoint. I offered her a sweet, chilling smile. "He is incredibly dedicated," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "But do not worry, Sienna. I have a feeling David is about to take a very long, very permanent vacation from all of his corporate responsibilities. He just needs to get through security first." Sienna finally looked up from her phone. She met my gaze, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. She detected something strange in my tone, a subtle, razor-sharp edge she could not quite identify. But her arrogance quickly overrode her instincts. She smirked, returning her attention to her screen. "I certainly hope so." "Claire," she said dismissively, "I think we are all ready for a change of scenery." I took another sip of my drink, letting the citrus and champagne burn the back of my throat. I stared at the Louis Vuitton bag on the floor, then looked up at the soundproof booth. David was hanging up his phone, turning around with a triumphant, satisfied smile. He stepped out of the booth and began walking toward us, completely unaware that he was marching straight into a slaughterhouse. The 3-minute window had closed. The trap was locked. It was time to walk to the guillotine. David approached our seating area with long, rapid strides. He slid his phone into his tailored suit pocket and clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that echoed in our quiet corner. Crisis averted, he announced, his voice overly loud and strained with artificial relief. The London board accepted my preliminary numbers. We are completely in the clear. He looked at me, then glanced quickly at my black suitcase resting against the frosted glass partition. His eyes lingered on the zipper for a fraction of a second too long. Ready to go, darling. I stood up smoothly, smoothing the wrinkles from my trousers. Absolutely ready. Sienna rose from her chair, grabbing the handle of her Louis Vuitton rolling bag, the bag that now carried a federal prison sentence hidden deep within its lining. She adjusted her designer trench coat and offered David a brief, knowing smile. "Let us get moving," she said. "I have a long flight ahead of me." David reached for my black suitcase, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle. He hauled it up with a sudden jerky movement, overcompensating for the weight he expected to feel. A look of confusion flashed across his face when the suitcase lifted far easier than it should have. The 3-pound brick of narcotics was gone, but his brain had not yet processed the physical discrepancy. He readjusted his grip, blaming the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I picked up my leather tote bag, slinging it over my shoulder, and stepped into the aisle. We exited the first-class lounge and merged into the bustling flow of the international terminal. The walk to the priority security checkpoint was a mere 200 yards, but the psychological distance felt like a marathon. I observed David closely as we walked. His facade of the relaxed husband was rapidly deteriorating. A heavy sheen of sweat had formed on the back of his neck, glistening under the bright terminal lights. He was walking entirely too fast, his long legs eating up the polished concrete floor, forcing Sienna and me to hurry our pace just to keep up. He kept looking over his shoulder, checking to make sure I was right behind him. He wanted to keep his prize securely in his line of sight. Sienna trailed slightly to my left. The polyurethane wheels of her Louis Vuitton bag hummed a steady rhythmic tune against the floor. Every rotation of those wheels carried $8 million in stolen corporate funds and 3 pounds of synthetic narcotics closer to the federal authorities. She was complaining about the dry airport air, utterly oblivious to the fact that she was currently the highest value target in the entire building. The contrast between my husband's frantic energy and my absolute glacial calm was striking. I matched his urgent pace step for step, but my breathing remained perfectly regulated. I was a spectator watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. David was rushing toward his own execution, dragging his mistress along as collateral damage. He thought he was playing the final move in a chess match he had rigged from the start. He had no idea the board had been flipped. The priority security checkpoint loomed ahead. The area was cordoned off with thick velvet ropes and staffed by stern-faced Transportation Security Administration officers. Beyond the podiums, the massive gray X-ray scanners swallowed luggage on heavy black conveyor belts. David practically shoved his boarding pass and identification at the agent working the podium. He bounced on the balls of his feet, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his cheek twitched. I handed my documents to the agent with a polite, easy smile, offering a pleasant morning greeting. The agent nodded, checked my passport against my ticket, and waved us through. We entered the screening area. The air smelled of ozone floor wax and the nervous sweat of rushing travelers. The ambient noise was a chaotic symphony of rattling plastic bins, sharp commands from security personnel, and the low mechanical drone of the scanning machines. David bypassed an empty lane and aggressively steered us toward a specific conveyor belt on the far right. He wanted a lane with a clear, unobstructed view of the monitor. He wanted front-row seats to my destruction. He grabbed 3 gray plastic bins from the stack and slammed them onto the metal rollers. He turned to me, his eyes wide and dilated with manic anticipation. "Go ahead, Claire," he urged, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed excitement. "You go first. Put your things on the belt. Let us get you through quickly so we can relax. He physically stepped aside, blocking Sienna from moving forward, ensuring I was the one standing directly in front of the machine. He positioned himself perfectly to watch the agent's face when my black suitcase entered the scanner. I stepped up to the stainless steel rollers. The moment had finally arrived. The culmination of months of horrific gaslighting, obsessive financial tracking, and meticulous midnight planning, all hinged on the next 60 seconds. I did not hesitate. I moved with fluid grace. I took off my coat and laid it neatly inside the first gray bin. I placed my heavy leather tote bag into the second bin, making sure my laptop was removed and placed in a separate tray as required by federal regulations. Then I reached for the handle of my black suitcase. David hovered just inches away from my shoulder, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was practically vibrating with a toxic mix of fear and impending victory. I lifted the black suitcase and placed it squarely onto the conveyor belt. The heavy fabric settled against the rubber rollers with a dull thud. I looked at David. His eyes were fixed on the bag with a horrifying, hungry intensity. He was waiting for the sirens to blare. He was waiting for the heavy hands of the law to pull me down to the cold floor. I turned my attention back to the security lane. I stood perfectly still, letting my hands fall relaxed at my sides. My heartbeat was a steady, powerful drum in my chest. I watched the heavy black rubber flaps of the X-ray machine part swallowing my suitcase into the dark scanning tunnel. I did not look away. I waited for the machine to do its job, knowing with absolute terrifying certainty that the screen would show nothing but silk dresses and linen trousers. The heavy black rubber flaps of the X-ray machine swallowed my suitcase. I kept my eyes fixed on the illuminated monitor suspended above the transportation security agent station. The screen displayed a vibrant, shifting landscape of colors as the internal contents of my luggage were stripped bare by the penetrating radiation. Bright blues indicated the metallic zippers and hardware. Dense oranges and greens mapped out the organic material of my folded silk dresses and linen trousers. David was standing so close to the conveyor belt that his tailored suit jacket brushed against the stainless steel edge. He was leaning forward, his neck craned at an unnatural angle to get a clear view of the monitors. He was waiting for a massive, dense block of orange to appear on the screen. He was waiting for the unmistakable rectangular void that indicated a densely packed brick of synthetic narcotics. He held his breath. His entire body was a coiled spring wound so tightly that I could practically see the adrenaline coursing through the veins in his neck. The transportation security agent stared blankly at the screen. He held a half-empty bottle of water in one hand, his eyes glazed over with the profound boredom of a man who had already stared at 1,000 identical suitcases that morning. The conveyor belt hummed its steady mechanical tune. The glowing image of my luggage scrolled smoothly across the monitor. There was no rectangular void. There was no dense, anomalous block of organic matter hidden in the lining. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The agent blinked lazily, took a sip of his water and looked away from the screen. He did not hit the red emergency stop button. He did not reach for his radio. He did not signal the armed officers standing near the perimeter. The heavy rubber flaps on the exit side of the machine parted, and my sleek black suitcase rolled out into the bright terminal light completely untouched. I turned away from the belt and stepped confidently toward the advanced imaging technology scanner. I handed my boarding pass to the agent guarding the entrance, offered a polite nod, and stepped inside the cylindrical machine. I placed my feet precisely on the yellow-painted footprints. I raised my arms above my head, locking my hands together in the designated position. The mechanical arm of the scanner whirred to life, rotating swiftly around my body. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, reveling in the absolute pristine cleanliness of my current state. I was carrying nothing but my identification and a boarding pass. I was legally and physically untouchable. "Step out, please," the agent instructed, pointing toward the exit. I stepped out of the scanner. The small monitor attached to the machine displayed a solid, comforting green screen. No anomalies detected, no secondary pat-down required. I was entirely clear. I walked casually over to the stainless steel collection area where my plastic bins and my black suitcase were waiting. I slipped my shoes back onto my feet. I grabbed my laptop from its plastic tray and slid it effortlessly into my heavy leather tote bag. Then I wrapped my fingers around the telescopic handle of my black suitcase and pulled it off the rollers. I looked back across the security lane at my husband. David had not moved a single inch. He was frozen in place, staring at the empty space on the conveyor belt where my suitcase had been just moments before. His hands were gripping the edge of the metal table so fiercely that his knuckles were entirely white. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just watched the laws of physics reverse themselves in front of his eyes. His reality was actively shattering into a million jagged pieces. He looked at the bored security agent, then back to the empty conveyor belt, and finally his panicked gaze snapped across the checkpoint to meet mine. I offered him a gentle, encouraging wave. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest began to heave in rapid, shallow jerks. He was hyperventilating. The meticulous, arrogant corporate vice president was actively short-circuiting in the middle of the priority security lane. His brain was desperately trying to process an impossible equation. He knew exactly what he had done at 2 in the morning. He vividly remembered the feel of the utility blade slicing through the nylon fabric of my luggage. He remembered the heavy, dense weight of the black duct tape package. He remembered burying it, hiding it, sealing my fate with his own 2 hands, and yet the suitcase had passed through federal security without raising a single alarm. I could see the frantic, terrified calculations racing behind his wide eyes. Had the X-ray machine malfunctioned? That was statistically impossible. Had the security agent simply missed it? A package that large would be glaringly obvious even to a blind man. Did he somehow forget to pack it? No. The memory was burned into his mind. He had felt the package. He had secured the zipper. The only remaining logical conclusion was so terrifying, so fundamentally disruptive to his sense of control, that his mind simply refused to accept it. The package was gone. David took a stumbling half-step backward, bumping heavily into the person standing directly behind him. He did not even turn around to apologize. A bead of cold sweat broke loose from his hairline, trailing a slow, agonizing path down the side of his pale cheek. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his deflating frame. He reached a trembling hand up to loosen his silk tie, struggling to pull oxygen into his restricting lungs. "Move forward, sir!" A security agent barked, pointing impatiently at the empty space in front of David. "You are holding up the line. Put your items in the bin and step through the metal detector." David jumped at the sharp command, his shoulders twitching violently. He looked completely lost. He fumbled blindly with his pockets, pulling out his wallet, his keys, his expensive phone, dumping them into a gray plastic tray with clumsy, uncoordinated movements. His hands were shaking so severely that a few coins spilled over the edge and clattered loudly against the stainless steel table. "Sir," the agent repeated, her voice dripping with irritation. "Your bags. Place them on the belt." Right behind him, Sienna let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of annoyance. "David, honestly," she muttered, pushing her pristine Louis Vuitton rolling bag forward until it bumped against the back of his calves. "What is taking you so long? You are holding both of us up. Just push the bins forward so I can get my things through." David did not answer her. He could not speak. He was entirely consumed by the blinding panic of a predator who suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of an empty trap. He shoved his briefcase and his overnight bag onto the conveyor belt with jerky mechanical shoves. He stumbled blindly toward the metal detector. His eyes glazed, his mind spinning wildly out of control. I stood patiently at the end of the collection area, gripping the handle of my completely clean suitcase. I watched Sienna lift her heavy designer luggage onto the metal rollers. I watched her push it toward the dark, gaping mouth of the X-ray tunnel. David staggered through the metal detector, his eyes locked onto my face, searching desperately for an answer, a clue, a shred of understanding. I just tilted my head, offering him that same sweet, oblivious smile. The game was no longer his, the executioner had arrived. Sienna stepped through the advanced imaging scanner with the exaggerated sigh of a woman profoundly inconvenienced by the rules of ordinary citizens. She patted her perfectly styled hair, retrieved her designer trench coat from the gray plastic bin, and slipped it over her shoulders with a theatrical flourish. She did not look at David. She certainly did not look at me. Her entire focus was fixed on the exit, eager to escape the tedious security checkpoint and head toward her luxurious international flight. Her pristine Louis Vuitton rolling bag was next in line. It glided along the stainless steel rollers, bumped against the rubber guard, and was swallowed by the dark tunnel of the X-ray scanner. I kept my eyes locked on the Transportation Security Administration agent operating the monitor. Just seconds ago, this man had been the picture of bureaucratic apathy, sipping water and staring blankly at the endless parade of neck pillows and toiletry bags. The moment Sienna's designer luggage slid across his screen, his entire demeanor fractured. He stopped chewing his gum. His spine snapped perfectly straight, pressing hard against the back of his ergonomic chair. He leaned so far forward that his nose nearly touched the glass of the monitor. His hand flew across the control panel, typing a rapid sequence of commands to enhance the image, altering the contrast and density settings. Whatever he was seeing, it was massive, anomalous, and terrifyingly dense. He did not hesitate. His hand shot out and slammed down on a large red button mounted on the side of his console. The continuous droning hum of the conveyor belt died instantly. The stainless steel rollers locked into place with a violent mechanical screech that echoed sharply across the terminal. Then the alarms began. It was not a quiet, discreet alert. It was a blaring, high-decibel siren that cut through the ambient airport chatter like a physical weapon. Strobe lights mounted on the ceiling above our specific security lane flashed in rapid, blinding intervals. The mundane routine of the checkpoint completely evaporated, replaced instantly by the rigid, electrified atmosphere of a severe federal threat. Sienna jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She looked up at the flashing lights, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure indignation. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, tapping her designer boot aggressively against the linoleum floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Sienna huffed, her voice carrying over the blaring alarm. She glared at the security agent behind the monitor. "Excuse me. Turn that noise off. My flight leaves in an hour and you are holding up my bag. I have premier status. This is completely unacceptable." She genuinely believed it was a minor bureaucratic error. She thought a bottle of expensive perfume had leaked, or a curling iron had triggered a false positive. Her arrogance was so deeply entrenched that the concept of real, unmitigated danger had not even breached her consciousness. She tapped her screen, pulling up her airline app, ready to display her boarding pass and demand to speak to a supervisor. David, however, was experiencing a completely different reality. He stood 3 feet away from her and he was physically unraveling. When the conveyor belt stopped, his entire body seized. He looked at the X-ray monitor, then at the dark opening of the machine where Sienna's luggage was trapped, and finally he looked back at me. The mathematical equation in his brain finally clicked into place. The impossible variables aligned. The heavy 3-pound brick of synthetic narcotics and the encrypted drive holding 8 million stolen dollars had not vanished into thin air. It had simply changed addresses. I maintained my gentle, unbothered smile, holding his gaze with absolute chilling calm. David looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. His complexion shifted from ashen gray to a sickly, translucent white. He reached up, his trembling fingers clawing desperately at the knot of his silk tie. He yanked it downward, tearing the top button of his expensive dress shirt off in the process. He needed oxygen, but his lungs were entirely locked. He staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly, his polished leather shoes slipping on the slick floor. "David, do something!" Sienna snapped, turning to face him. "Tell them who you are. Tell them we are flying first class and they need to release my luggage right now." David could not speak. His mouth opened and closed in rapid, silent gasps, like a fish pulled from the ocean and thrown onto a burning dock. He clutched his chest right over his heart. His breathing reduced to shallow, ragged wheezes. He knew exactly what was inside that bag, and he knew exactly whose name was attached to it. The life sentence he had meticulously crafted for his wife was now sitting squarely in the lap of his mistress. And because they were traveling together because he had booked her ticket with his corporate card, the blast radius of this explosion was going to incinerate him right alongside her. "Clear the lane! Clear the immediate area right now!" The commanding shout originated from the far end of the checkpoint. The standard agents rapidly backed away, forming a wide perimeter. Heavy synchronized footsteps pounded against the concrete floor, moving with terrifying speed. A specialized federal tactical unit charged toward the scanner. They were dressed in dark, heavy tactical gear, their faces grim and focused. But it was not just the armed officers that caused the crowd of waiting passengers to gasp and step back. It was the canine unit. The same German shepherd that had alerted to Sienna's bag in the priority queue was back, and this time, the animal was absolutely feral. The handler could barely hold the heavy leather leash as the dog surged forward, its claws scrambling for traction on the smooth floor. The dog dragged the officer directly toward the stalled conveyor belt. It did not just sit this time. The dog lunged at the machine, barking with a ferocious, deafening intensity, its front paws scratching frantically at the rubber flaps, trying to get to the Louis Vuitton bag trapped inside. Sienna finally stopped tapping her phone. Her indignant posture collapsed as the massive, aggressive animal barked furiously at her possessions. She took a frightened step backward, her eyes widening in genuine alarm. "What is happening?" she stammered, her high-pitched voice cracking. "Why is that dog doing that? Get it away from my things! Do not move another inch!" A tactical officer barked, pointing a stern finger directly at her chest. David was having a full-blown panic attack. His legs finally gave out. He crashed heavily into a stack of empty gray plastic bins, sending them clattering across the checkpoint. He slid down the wall, hitting the floor hard. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his head, rocking back and forth. The sophisticated, arrogant corporate vice president was reduced to a hyperventilating, terrified child. He was watching his entire universe burn to ash, and he knew there was absolutely no escape. I stood quietly at the edge of the collection zone. My posture relaxed. My hands folded neatly over the handle of my completely clean suitcase. I watched the tactical team swarm Sienna's bag. I watched the dog continue its frantic positive alert. I watched my husband gasp for air on the cold airport floor. The execution was proceeding exactly according to plan, and the explosion was only just beginning. The tactical team secured the perimeter with breathtaking efficiency. Passengers in the adjacent lanes were shoved backward, their complaints silenced by the hard stares of heavily armed federal agents. The air in the terminal felt thick, charged with the heavy electric tension of an active law enforcement operation. The German shepherd was finally pulled back, its handler struggling to control the animal's aggressive lunges toward Sienna's bag. Then the crowd parted. A tall, imposing figure strode through the security lane. He wore the dark navy uniform of a Customs and Border Protection captain. The gold badges on his collar gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His presence commanded absolute immediate silence. It was a silence born of respect, authority, and undeniable power. It was Jamal. My brother-in-law, Jamal, the husband of my younger sister, Rachel. A man who had built his career on an unwavering, ironclad foundation of integrity. He was a force of nature within the federal agency, known for dismantling smuggling rings with ruthless precision. He did not play politics. He did not bend rules. He was the kind of officer who would arrest his own mother if she tried to bypass a customs declaration. He walked directly toward the stalled conveyor belt. His dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in the hyperventilating David on the floor, the terrified Sienna shrinking against the metal table, and finally me. Our eyes met. Jamal did not smile. He did not offer a comforting wave or a familial greeting. His expression remained entirely stoic, a mask of pure professional authority. But in the microscopic fraction of a second that our gaze held, I saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken confirmation that the board was set, the pieces were in place, and the endgame was officially underway. He broke eye contact and turned his piercing gaze toward Sienna. She recoiled, pressing her back flat against the stainless steel table, her expensive trench coat slipping off her shoulders. "Captain," the transportation security agent said, his voice trembling slightly. "We have a positive alert from the K9 unit on this bag. Passenger claims ownership." Jamal stepped up to the Louis Vuitton rolling bag. He did not ask for permission. He grabbed the gold zipper pulls and yanked the main compartment open. He did not bother sifting through the designer clothing. His large hands drove straight into the base of the luggage, feeling the unnatural rigidity along the spine. He found the internal zipper, the one I had closed just 10 minutes prior. He pulled it open. The heavy black duct-taped package was sitting right there, nestled among the structural ribs of the suitcase. Jamal reached in and pulled the 3-pound brick of synthetic narcotics out into the bright terminal light. He held it up, inspecting the meticulous wrapping. He did not look surprised. He looked like a hunter who had just cornered his prey. "Who owns this bag?" Jamal demanded, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that echoed across the silent checkpoint. Sienna's jaw trembled. She looked at the black package, then at Jamal, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She raised a shaking finger and pointed directly at David, who was still huddled on the floor, gasping for air. "He is my boss," Sienna stammered, her voice cracking. "He paid for my ticket. He made me carry that bag. I do not know what that is. He packed it." Jamal turned slowly, looking down at David. The corporate vice president was a pathetic, broken shell of a man. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face was slick with cold sweat. He looked up at Jamal, his eyes darting frantically between the imposing federal officer and the black package of drugs. Sir Jamal said, his tone devoid of any emotion, "Is this your luggage?" David tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He collapsed back against the plastic bins, his hands grasping desperately at his own chest. His mind was actively shattering. The arrogant, calculating embezzler was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified animal trapped in a corner. He looked at Sienna, then at the package, and finally his panicked gaze snapped to me. I stood there, a picture of calm, unbothered innocence. I offered him a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of my head. It was the physical embodiment of his own favorite phrase. "You are losing your grip." David stared at me, his eyes widening in a sudden, horrifying realization. He saw the trap. He saw the cold, calculated precision of my revenge. He realized that his brilliant, foolproof plan to send his wife to a foreign prison had just been reversed with lethal accuracy. The absolute terror of his situation broke his mind completely. The rational corporate facade evaporated, leaving only blind, primal panic. "No," David screamed, his voice raw and hysterical. "No, that is wrong." He scrambled onto his knees, pointing a trembling finger at the black package in Jamal's hand. He lost all sense of self-preservation. The panic overrode his survival instincts. He just wanted the nightmare to stop, and in his desperation he made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. "That is impossible." David shrieked, his face contorted in absolute terror. "That was supposed to be in my wife's bag." The entire checkpoint froze. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and profound. The transportation security agent stared at him in disbelief. Sienna covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock. The waiting passengers in the adjacent lanes gasped. David had just confessed. He had just admitted in front of a dozen federal officers and countless witnesses that he had intended to plant 3 pounds of synthetic narcotics in his wife's luggage. He had just handed them the entire case on a silver platter. Jamal did not blink. His expression remained incredibly stoic, but I could see the quiet, dangerous satisfaction burning behind his dark eyes. He slowly lowered the black package, resting it on the metal table. He reached up and tapped the small black body camera mounted on the center of his chest. "Thank you for the confession, sir," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying rumble. He gestured to the tactical officer standing behind him. "Hands behind your back. You are both under arrest for international drug trafficking." 2 armed officers surged forward. They grabbed David by the arms, hauling him to his feet with rough, unyielding force. They slammed him against the stainless steel table, pulling his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the terminal was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Sienna started screaming a high-pitched, hysterical wail as another officer grabbed her arms. She fought against the restraints, kicking and thrashing, begging them to let her go. David did not fight. He went completely limp, his eyes glazed, his spirit entirely broken. He stared at me as they dragged him away, his face a mask of absolute, unmitigated horror. I stood quietly by the collection area, my hands folded neatly over the handle of my clean suitcase. I watched them drag my husband and his mistress away in handcuffs. The explosion was complete and the execution was flawless. The reality of a federal drug bust is not a cinematic event filled with dramatic musical scores or slow-motion heroics. It happens with brutal, suffocating velocity. Jamal stood like a statue carved from obsidian, the heavy black-taped package resting securely on his broad palm. The golden captain badges on his uniform collar caught the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal. He did not break eye contact with Sienna. The young executive secretary was pressing herself so hard against the stainless steel inspection table that her knuckles were turning completely white. Sienna looked at the vacuum-sealed brick of narcotics and then down at her pristine designer bag. The mathematical equation finally connected in her brain. She was standing in the middle of an international airport with trafficking quantities of synthetic drugs hidden inside her personal property. She opened her mouth and a sound completely devoid of human dignity ripped from her throat. It was a shrill, vibrating shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. "I have never seen that before," Sienna sobbed. Her manicured hands shook violently as she pointed a trembling finger directly at David. "He is my boss. He bought my ticket. He insisted on loading the car this morning. He put that in there. I am just a secretary. He is setting me up. Please, you have to believe me. I do not know what that is." Jamal did not flinch. He did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. He turned his heavy, piercing gaze down to the floor where David was currently suffocating on his own manufactured panic. David was curled against the base of the scanning machine. His expensive tailored suit jacket was covered in the gray dust of the airport floor. He was clutching his chest, pulling in rapid, shallow gulps of air that did nothing to fill his lungs. He looked up at Jamal, then at the hysterical Sienna, and finally his bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I stood exactly where I was. My posture was perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the telescopic handle of my clean suitcase. I did not offer him a lifeline. I did not scream or cry. I offered him the exact devastating silence he had used against me for the past year. David's mind simply could not process the failure of his own brilliance. He was a powerful vice president. He was the smartest man in the boardroom. He had orchestrated the perfect corporate embezzlement and the perfect marital execution. The cognitive dissonance of seeing the executioner's blade swinging rapidly toward his own neck shattered his psychological framework entirely. The rational, calculating executive died on that linoleum floor, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. The desperation overrode every survival instinct he possessed. He scrambled forward onto his hands and knees, completely ignoring the federal tactical officers who instantly placed their hands on their holstered weapons at his sudden, erratic movement. He pointed a shaking, sweaty finger at the black brick resting in Jamal's hand. "That is impossible!" David screamed. His voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed across the vaulted ceilings of the terminal. "That is not supposed to be there. That was supposed to be in my wife's bag." The entire security checkpoint plunged into a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. The murmuring passengers, the rattling plastic bins, the ambient terminal announcements all instantly evaporated. Every single person in the vicinity turned to stare at the man on the floor. Sienna stopped crying. Her jaw dropped open as she stared at the man she had been sleeping with. She realized in that exact horrifying second that he had never planned to protect her. He had planned to use her as a decoy if his operation went south. The romance, the luxury hotel stays, the expensive jewelry, it was all a down payment for her role as his collateral damage. Jamal slowly lowered the package onto the metal inspection table. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding federal authority. He reached up with a steady hand and firmly tapped the small square body camera mounted to the center of his tactical vest. A tiny red light blinked steadily, confirming it was actively recording every single word spoken in the lane. "Thank you for the confession, Sir," Jamal said. His deep voice resonated with absolute terrifying finality. "Hands behind your back." The command broke the spell. The tactical officers descended on David like wolves. They grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him off the floor, with zero regard for his expensive tailoring. They slammed him chest first against the stainless steel inspection table right next to the package of narcotics. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Two female Customs and Border Protection officers stepped forward, securing Sienna's arms behind her back. She did not fight them. She just stood there, openly weeping, her mascara running in dark, jagged streams down her pale cheeks. The pristine designer luggage she had been so incredibly proud of was now being tagged and bagged as federal evidence. Jamal stepped directly in front of David. He leaned down slightly, ensuring his voice was captured perfectly by the microphone on his vest. "You have the right to remain silent." Jamal began reciting the Miranda warning with chilling precision. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." David was hyperventilating, his cheek pressed hard against the cold metal table. He twisted his neck, straining against the iron grip of the tactical officers searching frantically for me through the crowd of uniforms. "Claire," he begged, tears mixed with the heavy sweat pouring down his face. "Claire, tell them. Tell them I am innocent. Please, you have to help me. Tell them this is a mistake." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I stopped just outside the perimeter established by the tactical team. I looked down at the man who had spent months trying to convince me I was losing my mind. The man who had stolen $8 million and planned to let me rot in a foreign prison while he drank champagne on a tropical island. I leaned forward slightly, dropping my voice to a sharp whisper that only he and Jamal could hear. "You are just imagining things, David," I said softly, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "You are losing your grip." The color drained from his face entirely. His eyes rolled back slightly, the absolute horror of his reality finally crushing his spirit. Jamal signaled to the officers. They hoisted David up and began marching him through the terminal. The crowd of delayed passengers parted like the Red Sea. Hundreds of people held up their smartphones, recording the wealthy, arrogant executive being dragged away in absolute disgrace. Sienna followed behind him, her head bowed in profound shame. The flashing red and blue strobes from the checkpoint illuminated the concourse, casting long, erratic shadows against the walls. The sound of their shuffling footsteps faded into the distance, drowned out by the urgent whispers of the surrounding crowd uploading their videos to social media. A profound sense of lightness washed over my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating anxiety I had carried for months evaporated into the sterile airport air. My husband had built a cage designed to hold me forever, but he had walked inside and handed me the key. I picked up my leather tote bag, adjusted my coat, and prepared for the final phase of his destruction. The stark, windowless interrogation room deep within the bowels of O'Hare International Airport was a masterclass in psychological pressure. Fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the scratched metal table bolted to the floor. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Inside this concrete box, the grand romance between the arrogant vice president and his ambitious secretary completely disintegrated. The illusion of their glamorous future shattered against the brutal reality of federal drug trafficking charges. Sienna was a mess of smeared mascara and tear-stained silk. Her designer trench coat lay crumpled on a plastic chair. She paced the small room like a caged animal, her voice shrill and desperate as she pointed a shaking finger at David. "He set me up. He told me to pack that bag. I didn't know what was in it. He's trying to ruin my life." David sat slouched in a metal chair, his expensive suit disheveled, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. The confident, calculating executive was gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified man desperately trying to save himself. "She's lying. She's a mule. I didn't know anything about those drugs. She's trying to pin this on me." The accusations flew back and forth, a pathetic, ugly display of self-preservation. The partnership built on stolen money and deceit dissolved into mutual betrayal the moment the stakes became real. They were turning on each other, tearing each other apart, completely oblivious to the fact that they were both already doomed. Jamal stood silently by the heavy steel door, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression an unreadable mask of federal authority. He watched the spectacle with the detached observation of a seasoned officer accustomed to seeing the worst of human nature. He didn't intervene. He just let them dig their graves deeper with every panicked accusation. Then the heavy metal door clicked open. The bickering stopped instantly. Both David and Sienna snapped their heads toward the sound, their eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope that their lawyer had arrived. Instead, I walked in. I was not wearing handcuffs. I was not escorted by tactical officers. I walked in accompanied by my powerhouse corporate attorney, a woman named Evelyn, whose reputation for dismantling corrupt executives preceded her. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of calm, cold resolve. David's jaw dropped. The desperate hope in his eyes vanished, replaced by a profound, sickening realization. He saw me standing there, free, untouchable, and flanked by legal representation. He finally understood that the trap had not just sprung on Sienna. It had sprung on both of them, and I was the one holding the remote detonator. Claire, David whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer him. I didn't scream or cry or hurl accusations. I simply walked over to the metal table, pulled out the chair opposite him, and sat down. Evelyn stood silently behind me, a formidable presence, projecting absolute legal authority. I placed a thick, pristine, color-coded audit portfolio onto the scratched metal surface. The sound it made was soft, yet it resonated in the small room with the finality of a gavel striking a block. David stared at the portfolio, his eyes darting between the document and my face. The last vestige of his arrogant facade crumbled, leaving nothing but sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew what was in that portfolio. He knew exactly what I held in my hands. And he knew with terrifying certainty that his life as he knew it was officially over. David stared at the portfolio. The pristine, color-coded tabs seemed to mock the absolute chaos of his current reality. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the heavy cardstock cover, terrified to actually touch it. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for any sign of mercy. He found none. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cold metal table, and delivered the execution order with chilling, measured precision. "You really thought I was just imagining things, didn't you, David?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed off the concrete walls. "You spent months trying to convince me I was crazy. You isolated me. You made me question my own memory. You thought you had broken me down into a compliant, paranoid shell." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of my words press down on his chest. "But you made one fatal mistake," I continued. "You forgot who you married. You forgot that I dismantle financial lies for a living." I reached out and slowly flipped open the portfolio. The first page displayed a massive, complex flowchart. It traced the origin of the $8 million, detailing the phantom supply chain invoices, the Delaware shell companies, and the offshore wire transfers. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a meticulously documented roadmap of his corporate treason. David's breath hitched. He stared at the flowchart, his eyes tracing the red lines connecting his supposedly hidden accounts. The blood drained from his face completely. He looked as though he might physically collapse. "I found the USB drive, David," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying absolute calm. "The one you tried to bury beneath 3 pounds of synthetic narcotics in my suitcase. The one you thought would guarantee me a life sentence in a Maldivian prison." Sienna gasped from the corner of the room, her hands flying to her mouth. She hadn't known about the embezzlement. She hadn't known the true scale of the monster she had been sleeping with. "I bypassed your military-grade encryption in 7 minutes. I stated, leaning back in my chair. I copied every single byte of data, the seed phrases for your cryptocurrency wallets, the fabricated emails designed to frame me, and of course the master ledger of your little $8 million pharmaceutical heist. David let out a choked, desperate sound. He grabbed the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Claire, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. We can make a deal. I'll give you everything. The house, the accounts, whatever you want. Just don't give them the drive." I offered him a small, cold smile. "You're losing your grip, David," I said, throwing his favorite gaslighting phrase right back in his face. I checked my watch. It's currently 10:45 a.m. At exactly 6 a.m. this morning, while you were busy loading my suitcase into the SUV, I initiated a secure automated data transfer. I paused, ensuring he caught every single word. I sent the complete, unredacted contents of your USB drive directly to the Chicago field office of the FBI. I sent a copy to the Enforcement Division of the SEC. And just for good measure, I sent the entire portfolio to the personal email address of your CEO. David's eyes rolled back slightly. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the metal table with a dull thud. A low, agonizing groan escaped his lips. "You aren't just going down for international drug trafficking, David," I concluded, standing up and smoothing the wrinkles from my trousers. "You are going down for massive federal corporate fraud. Your company is already freezing your assets. The FBI is likely raiding your office right now. You are going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." I turned away from the table and walked toward the heavy steel door. I didn't look back at Sienna, who was now weeping openly, realizing her life was truly and utterly destroyed. I didn't look back at David, who was sobbing against the cold metal, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man he once was. Jamal opened the door for me, his expression remaining perfectly stoic, but I caught the slight, respectful nod he offered as I passed. I stepped out of the interrogation room and into the bright, bustling hallway of the airport. The air felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating anxiety I had carried for months had evaporated entirely. The execution was complete. The monster was caged. I walked toward the exit, my head held high, ready to step into a future that finally belonged entirely to me. The overarching narrative woven through these profound experiences highlights one of the most painful, yet ultimately liberating lessons a person can learn. Your inherent self-worth is never dictated by those who refuse to see it, even if those people are your own family. For years, the protagonists in these stories sought validation from parents and siblings who continually offered nothing but conditional love, exclusion, and manipulation. Whether it was being uninvited from a cherished family retreat, abandoned in a time of severe grief, or mocked for pursuing an independent path, the heartbreak was always rooted in the desperate hope that blood ties would eventually guarantee basic respect. However, the true turning point in each story arrives when that hope is finally relinquished. The lesson here is that establishing firm boundaries and walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of cruelty or revenge, it is an essential act of self-preservation. When you stop fighting to be valued by people committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your own power. You realize that you cannot control how others treat you, but you possess absolute control over what you are willing to accept. By stepping away from the cycle of emotional abuse and conditional approval, we open the door to build our own chosen family. We learn that genuine love is defined by those who show up during our darkest moments and celebrate our victories without an underlying agenda. True success is not about forcing toxic people to respect you. It is about building a life so authentically fulfilling that their opinions no longer matter. If you are currently exhausting yourself trying to earn the love of people who continually diminish you, take a step back today and choose to invest that energy into building your own boundaries instead.